The basement of the Seoul underground thrummed with danger, cigarette smoke curling through shadows where three identical men ruled an empire built on fear. But when she walked in, curves swaying, defiance burning in her eyes, something shifted in Kang Min-ho's chest, primal and impossible. His brothers froze. His gun hand trembled. In one heartbeat, he knew he would burn the world for her. She didn't know his name. She didn't know she'd just awakened a monster. Welcome to Afro-Korean stories where love has no borders. Please like, share, and subscribe for more Afro-Korean stories. The Seoul Underground operated beneath the glittering towers of the city above, a different world entirely, one where paper clips never existed and promises were written in blood. Kang Min-ho stood in the dim recesses of an abandoned warehouse, his tailored black suit immaculate despite the sweat-stained chaos around him. His brothers, Kang Jun-seo and Kang Tae-oh, flanked him on either side, triplets born exactly 27 years ago this very night, now standing at the helm of the Kang Syndicate's most lucrative operation. An underground auction was happening, one of the illegal diamond trades that had made their family obscenely wealthy. Min-ho's expression was stone, his jaw working silently as guards patrolled with assault rifles. His brothers were identical in appearance only. Min-ho was the oldest by 4 minutes and carried the weight of leadership across his broad shoulders like a crown of thorns. He wore danger the way other men wore cologne. "Next lot," the auctioneer called out, his voice crackling through the warehouse. Min-ho didn't look up from his diamond broker's report. The Kang brothers had built an empire in the shadows, real estate, pharmaceuticals, and yes, diamonds. But the real power lay in the secrets they kept and the people who owed them favors. Everyone in Seoul feared them, respected them, bowed to them. Min-ho had never needed anything he couldn't take. Then the side door opened. And his entire world tilted. She walked through the door like she owned it, curves moving with a confidence that seemed to defy the armed guards and criminal underworld surrounding her. Amarachi. That was the name whispered through the underground, a woman of mixed heritage, Afro-Korean, who'd become legendary for her intelligence networks and her refusal to be intimidated. She worked independently, selling information to the highest bidder, answering to no one. Min-ho had heard her name 1,000 times. He'd never imagined she would look like this. Her skin was a rich, warm brown that seemed to glow under the warehouse lights. She wore a fitted black dress that hugged every curve, her breasts heavy and full, her waist cinched, her hips impossibly round and hypnotic. Her hair fell in long braids down her back, adorned with gold threads. Gold-rimmed glasses covered intelligent, defiant eyes. She moved through the room like she was walking through her own private empire, head held high, shoulders back. Min-ho felt his chest constrict. It was a physical sensation, involuntary and terrifying. He, who had ordered men's deaths without blinking. He, who had negotiated with presidents and generals. He, who had trained himself to feel nothing. He felt everything. "I'm here to place a bid," Amarachi said, her voice like honey laced with poison, smooth, beautiful, lethal. She had a slight accent, a blend of English and Korean inflections that marked her as belonging nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The auctioneer looked confused. "Ms. Amarachi, this auction is for whoever has the money and the courage to bid," she finished, pulling out a sleek black card. "I have both." Min-ho's brother Jun-seo leaned over and whispered something that Min-ho didn't hear. His attention was consumed entirely by the woman now standing 20 feet away, placing bids against them with a calmness that suggested she had no idea she was playing a dangerous game with 3 men who could end her with a phone call. The bidding escalated. 100 million won. 150. 200. Amarachi didn't flinch. 300 million, she called out, her eyes glinting with something Min-ho couldn't name. His brother Tae-oh laughed, a low, dangerous sound. "She's insane." But Min-ho wasn't laughing. He was standing. Moving. Walking directly toward her while his security team exchanged confused glances. He'd never broken protocol before. He'd never broken anything because everything broke before him. Amarachi turned as he approached, and for the first time, Minho saw uncertainty flicker across her face. Good. She should be afraid. The diamonds are ours, he said softly, his Korean accent thick and menacing. Everything in this warehouse is ours. You're bidding on property you have no right to touch. Amarachi pushed her glasses up, meeting his gaze directly. I bid on what I want. I take what I bid on. The money is real. The offer stands. The warehouse had gone silent. Every guard, every criminal, every soul present understood they were watching something momentous unfold. The Kong triplets didn't negotiate. They didn't explain. They took. And yet, Minho found himself speaking again. What's your name? He asked, though he knew it. He needed to hear her say it. Amarachi, she said. Though I suspect you already knew that. I'm Kong Minho. Something changed in her expression when he said his name, a recognition of danger, yes, but also something else. Something that made her chin lift higher, her shoulders square more defiantly. Then you know I don't scare easily, Kong Minho. He smiled then, a rare expression that his brothers later said looked almost predatory. You should. Later that night, after the auction had concluded with the Kong brothers purchasing the diamonds at their bid and Amarachi disappearing into the Seoul night like smoke, Minho couldn't sleep. He lay in his penthouse suite on the 45th floor of the Kong building, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment. The way she'd moved. The defiance in her eyes. The way his body had responded to her presence with an intensity that felt like madness. Junesio and Teo found him on the balcony at 3 a.m, whiskey in hand, the Seoul skyline glittering below them like stolen diamonds. You're obsessed, Teo said, not a question. I'm not, Minho replied, but his voice lacked conviction. You let her walk out, Junesio added. You've never let anyone walk out on you. Minho didn't respond. He was thinking about Amarachi's words, I bid on what I want. I take what I bid on. He understood that language. He spoke it fluently. But this was different. This was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with bullets or blood. The following morning, Minho's security team delivered a file to his desk. Amarachi's background. Everything they could find, which, given the Kong family's resources, was substantial but frustratingly incomplete. She was 26 years old, mixed heritage, raised between Seoul and Lagos. Her father was Korean, her mother Nigerian. She'd lost both parents 5 years ago in an accident that the file labeled suspicious circumstances. Since then, she'd carved out an existence in the criminal underground as a broker, selling information to the highest bidder, maintaining careful neutrality with all the major crime families. Except now she'd made herself an enemy of the Kong triplets. Or perhaps, Minho thought darkly, something far more dangerous. The next week passed in a haze of obsession. Minho found himself having his security team track her movements. Not to harm her, he was surprised by how visceral his rejection of that idea was. To protect her. To know where she was. To understand her. He told himself it was strategic, that she'd proven herself a wild card and needed to be monitored. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He learned her routines. She lived in a modest apartment in the Gangnam district, far smaller than someone of her wealth should have chosen. She worked from a cafe called Neutral Ground, where she met clients and conducted her business with the precision of a chess master. She had no close friends, no romantic entanglements, no family to speak of. She was alone in the world the way Minho was alone, by choice, by necessity, by the demands of survival in their world. On the 8th day after the auction, Minho did something that startled even himself. He walked into the Neutral Ground cafe alone, no security detail, dressed in civilian clothes that didn't hide the predator underneath. The cafe was nearly empty on a Thursday morning, just Amarachi in her usual corner booth, laptop open, reading glasses perched on her nose, completely focused on whatever work consumed her attention. She didn't notice him at first. Minho used those precious seconds to study her, the way her fingers moved across the keyboard, the concentration in her expression, the soft rise and fall of her breasts as she breathed. She was even more beautiful in natural light. When she finally looked up, her eyes widened fractionally before the mask of coolness slid back into place. Kang Minho, she said, closing her laptop with deliberate slowness. Slumming in the coffee shops of the common people? Minho sat across from her without invitation. I wanted to understand you. Understand me? Amarachi leaned back, a sardonic smile playing at her lips. I'm quite simple, actually. I work. I survive. I don't bow to anyone. I know. He said it like a confession. That's the problem. For you? She tilted her head, genuinely curious now. Or for me? Minho felt something dangerous stir in his chest, something that wanted to possess her, protect her, own her. He'd never felt it before, and it terrified him in a way nothing else could. For both of us, I think. Amarachi stood abruptly. I don't do complications, Kang Minho. I have enough enemies without adding the most powerful mafia boss in Seoul to the list. Minho caught her wrist gently as she moved to leave. His grip was firm but careful, he'd never hurt her, he realized with startling clarity. Not ever. You already have me on the list. The only question is what position I occupy. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up at him. For a moment, vulnerability flickered across her face, quickly masked. Enemy is safer. Perhaps, Minho agreed, releasing her. But neither of us does safe, do we, Amarachi? She left the cafe without another word, but Minho saw the way her hands trembled as she gathered her things. A few days later, danger arrived in the form of Park Hyun-jun, a rival crime boss who'd been circling the Kong territory for months. Word came through the intelligence channels that Hyun-jun had taken an interest in Amarachi, not business interest, but personal. He'd been seen at the clubs she frequented, making inquiries about her availability, offering money and connections for her attention. Minho learned about it at 6 p.m. on a Friday evening, and by 6:15 p.m., he was in his car with Jun Seo and Taeo, heading to the nightclub where Hyun-jun was known to be. The drive gave him time to think about what he would do, what lengths he would go to. The answer terrified him because it was clear and absolute: anything. Everything. The club was underground, literally, a basement venue in Hongdae that catered to Seoul's criminal elite. The music was deafening, the lights strobing, the air thick with expensive perfume and sweat. Minho pushed through the crowd with the natural authority of a man who'd never been refused, his brothers flanking him like wolves. And there she was. Amarachi sat in VIP with Park Hyun-jun, and every cell in Minho's body screamed in protest. She wore a shimmering copper dress that made her skin glow like burnished gold, and Hyun-jun's hand was on her arm, his head bent close to hers, saying something that made her smile. It was a professional smile, Minho could see that, her intelligence at work, not her heart. But it didn't matter. The rage that consumed him was white-hot and primal. He moved toward them before conscious thought could catch up. Hyun-jun saw him coming and straightened, removing his hand from Amarachi's arm like he'd been burned. The smart choice. The survival choice. Kang Minho, Hyun-jun said, his voice carefully neutral. I didn't expect to see you here. Minho ignored him entirely, his focus locked on Amarachi. She was staring at him with an expression that mixed defiance and something else, something that looked like relief, like recognition, like she'd been waiting for him to come find her in the dark. We're leaving, Minho said to her, his voice low and lethal. I'm not going anywhere with you, Amarachi shot back, but there was no conviction in her words. Minho turned to look at Hyun-jun for the first time, and whatever he saw in that gaze must have been sufficient, because Hyun-jun's face went pale. The man stood and walked away from the VIP booth without another word, leaving Amarachi alone with Minho and the weight of everything unspoken between them. He was harmless, Amarachi said, standing up to face him. I was working. Gathering information. On what? Minho stepped closer, and she stepped back, their dance of push and pull playing out on the club floor while the music thundered around them. That's my business. Everything about you is my business now, Minho said, and the possessiveness in his voice should have terrified her. Instead, she just stared at him, her breathing quickening. You don't own me, Kong Minho. No, he agreed softly. But I will protect you. Whether you want me to or not. He reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. Her fingers were soft, warm, and they trembled slightly in his grip. They left the club together, her body so close to his that he could smell the vanilla and something uniquely hers, something that made his head spin. In the car on the way back to his penthouse, neither of them spoke. But Minho didn't let go of her hand. He held it like it was the only real thing in the world, like letting go might cause him to fracture into pieces. The penthouse was silent except for the hum of the city below them, 45 stories up in the sky where it felt like they were the only two people in Seoul. Minho poured whiskey into crystal glasses, and Amarachi walked around his living room like she was assessing an enemy's fortress, which, in some ways, she was. Why did you come? She asked finally, not turning to look at him. To the club. Minho didn't lie. He'd stopped doing that years ago, one of the few luxuries of absolute power. Because I couldn't stop thinking about you, and I found out another man was trying to get close to you, and every rational thought in my head told me to let you go, and the only response I had was rage. Amarachi turned to face him, her expression unreadable. That's possessiveness. That's obsession. That's not love. You're right, Minho said, walking toward her with slow, measured steps. It's not love. It's something darker and more dangerous. It's the need to protect something that belongs to me. And Amarachi, from the moment you walked into that warehouse, you belong to me. I don't belong to anyone, she whispered, but she didn't move away. They were inches apart now, the air between them electric and charged. Then let me belong to you instead, Minho said, and reached up to remove her glasses. Without them, her eyes were enormous and impossibly vulnerable. Let me serve you. Protect you. Ruin anyone who threatens you. You're insane, she breathed. Completely, he agreed. Only for you. He kissed her then, and the world stopped. Her lips were soft, surprised, and then responding with a hunger that matched his own. She tasted like expensive wine and danger, and Minho found himself pulling her closer, one hand on the small of her back, the other tangling in her braided hair. She made a sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, and pressed herself against him, her curves fitting perfectly against his hard frame. When he pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. This is a mistake, Amarachi said, but her hands were still fisted in his shirt. Probably, Minho agreed. Everything about this is a mistake. But I'm done pretending I can let you go. Over the following weeks, they became something neither of them expected or wanted. Amarachi came to his penthouse, sometimes willingly, sometimes because his security team found her and brought her. They fought constantly, fierce, passionate arguments that ended in desperate kisses that tasted like surrender. She tried to maintain her independence, her distance, her armor, but Minho was systematically dismantling it, brick by brick. He would leave gifts on her apartment doorstep, not jewelry, which would have felt too easy, but things that showed he was paying attention. Expensive coffee beans from the roaster she preferred. A first edition of a Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie novel she'd mentioned in passing. A silk scarf in deep purple that matched her eyes. Small, personal, devastating in their intimacy. Juneseo and Teo watched their oldest brother's transformation with a mixture of amusement and concern. Minho, who'd always been the most controlled, the most ruthless, the most impervious to human emotion, was now checking his phone every 5 minutes. He was distracted during crime family meetings. He'd literally threatened to kill 3 men for making disrespectful comments about Amarachi's mixed heritage. He's completely gone, Teo said to Juneseo as they watched Minho leave a business dinner early to go see her. Completely, Juneseo agreed. And I don't think he's coming back. 1 month after the club, Minho received intelligence that made his blood run cold. Amarachi had a secret, one she'd kept hidden even from him. She'd been working as an informant for the National Police Agency, feeding information about criminal activity to an undercover detective named Kim Sung-jun. The Kong family had enemies aplenty who would pay handsomely for that information, and if it became known, Amarachi's life wouldn't be worth the paper it was printed on. Min-ho sat in his office, staring at the security footage of Amarachi meeting with Detective Kim in a restaurant, her hand on his arm, laughing at something he'd said. The rage that consumed him was different from the jealousy he'd felt at the club. This was fear. This was the terror of losing her not to another man, but to her own choices, her own moral compass that refused to let the darkness of his world consume her entirely. He picked up his phone and called her. "Come to the penthouse," he said without preamble. "I can't. I have a meeting." "Now," he interrupted, his voice hard enough to cut stone. "And we need to talk about your friend Detective Kim." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "How did you?" "I know everything about you," Min-ho said. "Everything. Including things you don't want me to know." When Amarachi arrived at the penthouse an hour later, she was defensive and frightened in equal measure. Min-ho had dismissed all his staff, and the apartment was silent except for the sound of the city far below. "You're a cop," he said flatly. "Working for the National Police Agency." "I'm not a cop," Amarachi said, her chin lifting stubbornly. "I'm an informant. There's a difference. A distinction without meaning in my world." Min-ho turned away from her, unable to look at her without wanting to scream. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand what will happen to you if anyone finds out?" "Yes," Amarachi said quietly. "That's why I didn't tell you." "Because you don't trust me." Min-ho said it like an accusation, but it was really a question. "Because I trust you too much," Amarachi shot back. "I know what you are, Min-ho. I know what you're capable of. And if you know I'm an informant, you're in an impossible position. The crime families would expect you to execute me as a traitor. Your brothers would expect it. Your entire empire expects you to never let an enemy go unpunished." Min-ho was silent for a long moment. She was right. His position was impossible. A Kong couldn't protect an informant working against organized crime without losing face, without losing power, without losing everything he'd built. But he would. He absolutely would. "How long?" he asked. 2 years, Amarachi admitted. "Detective Kim came to me after my parents died. I think he suspected I might need money, or purpose, or something. He was right. I took the job to fund my life here, and then it became more. It became about actual justice. About trying to make things better." "Justice?" Min-ho laughed bitterly. "Justice doesn't exist in our world, Amarachi. There's only power and the illusion of control." "Then help me change that," she said, and her voice was so sincere that it broke something inside him. He turned to face her, and what he saw in her eyes was everything he'd been fighting against, the possibility of being someone better, of wanting something beyond power and domination. She represented a choice he'd never thought to make. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I help you and protect you, then you belong to me completely. Not as a mistress, not as an informant, not as anything other than mine. Do you understand?" Amarachi walked toward him, and with each step, he could see her resolve crystallizing. "I understand. No more working for Detective Kim." "No more," she agreed. "No more lying." "No more," she whispered. She was close enough to touch now, close enough to kiss, close enough that Min-ho could feel the heat radiating from her body. "Then I'm choosing you. I'm choosing to burn it all down if necessary to keep you safe." He kissed her then, fierce and claiming, and Amarachi responded with her own hunger, her own desperation. She pulled at his shirt, buttons scattering across the floor of his penthouse, and Min-ho lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist as he pressed her against the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Seoul. "I need you," she gasped against his mouth. "I need." "I know," he breathed, and picked her up, carrying her to his bedroom where the city lights reflected off white silk sheets. The scene that followed was theirs alone, a tangle of bodies and emotion, vulnerability meeting intensity, two broken people finding wholeness in each other. When Minho finally made love to her, not sex, but love, with a tenderness that contradicted everything his world had taught him, it felt like a vow. His hands traced her curves with reverence, his lips worshipped every inch of her skin, and when they came together, it felt like the world remade itself. Afterward, tangled in sheets with Amarachi's head on his chest, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin, Minho felt something he'd thought himself incapable of feeling: hope. The next morning, everything fell apart. Detective Kim showed up at Minho's office building at 7 a.m. with federal agents and an arrest warrant for illegal weapons trafficking. They didn't take Minho, he had lawyers and connections that made that impossible, but they made their point. Someone had tipped off law enforcement. Someone had given them names, dates, locations, evidence. Someone had broken faith. Minho stood in his office as his lawyer explained that Amarachi had provided a final, comprehensive report to the police before ending her work as an informant. She'd given them everything, including information about his personal operations, the ones he'd kept separate from his brothers, the ones that could theoretically be traced back to him. She hadn't given them enough to prosecute, but she'd given them enough to investigate. Enough to cause problems. Enough to betray him. He found her in his penthouse, casually drinking coffee as if she hadn't just set his world on fire. "You told them," he said quietly. Too quietly. Amarachi turned, and he saw the resignation in her expression. She'd been expecting this. "I had to." Detective Kim said if I didn't provide comprehensive evidence, they couldn't close the case. "I couldn't keep lying to them. I couldn't keep lying to you." "You lied to me about lying," Minho said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. "You told me no more lies, and then you went behind my back and I did my job," Amarachi finished. "The job I promised Detective Kim I would do when this was over. The job I took because I believed in it." Minho felt something inside him shatter. "Then leave." Amarachi stood, alarm crossing her face. "Minho." "I said leave," he repeated, each word a knife. "Get out of my penthouse, get out of my city, get out of my life." "You don't mean that," she said, walking toward him. "You're angry. You have a right to be angry." But nothing," Minho said, turning away. "You're dangerous, Amarachi. Not as an enemy, but as a liability. Every moment you're near me, you're compromising everything I built. My brothers, my business, my power. And I can't." He stopped, his voice cracking slightly before he controlled it. "I can't let anything compromise my control." "That's not true," Amarachi said, and there were tears in her voice. "You love me. I know you do. I feel it." "Love is a luxury I can't afford," Minho said, and heard his own lie like poison in the air. "You were interesting, Amarachi. Exciting. A distraction. But this was always going to end. You don't belong in my world." She left that night, taking only what she'd come with, leaving behind the gifts he'd given her arranged on the marble table in the penthouse. Minho found them after she was gone: the coffee beans, the book, the silk scarf. He gathered them together like sacred objects and locked them in his private safe. Junesio and Teo didn't ask questions. They could see their brother was destroying himself from the inside out, but they understood the code. You didn't interfere in another man's choices, especially when those choices were being made to protect the family. But 1 week after Amarachi disappeared from his life, things began to happen that Minho hadn't anticipated. First, there were the flowers. Dozens of them, left at his office, his apartment, his favorite restaurant. Purple flowers, Amarachi's favorite color. No note, but the message was clear. Someone was watching. Someone was making a move. Then came the photographs. Sent to his secure email with no subject line, no message. Just image after image of Amarachi, going to a market, sitting in a cafe, walking through her apartment building. She was being followed. Hunted. Minho's blood went cold. He called Detective Kim within the hour. "Where is she?" Minho demanded without preamble. Detective Kim's voice was careful. "Ms. Amarachi is in protective custody. We believe there's a threat against her life." "Who?" Minho asked, though part of him already knew. "We're still investigating, but our intel suggests it might be the Saw family operating out of Busan. Word is they're angry about some information she provided that cost them a major operation." After he hung up with Detective Kim, Minho sat in his office for exactly 4 minutes. Then he called Jun Seo and Teo. "The Saw family has taken an interest in Amarachi," he said flatly. "We need to discuss appropriate responses." His brothers exchanged a glance, and Minho saw the understanding pass between them. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about a line that had been drawn and a choice that needed to be made. "What do you need?" Jun Seo asked simply. "Everything," Minho said. "I need to know everything about the Saw family's operations, their weaknesses, their allies. And I need it in the next 2 hours." By 10 p.m. that night, the Kong triplets had gathered their most trusted soldiers and were planning what could only be described as a preemptive strike. The Saw family had made a grave mistake. They'd made an enemy of a man who would literally burn the world for the woman he loved. Minho kept repeating those words in his head like a mantra. The woman he loved. Not the woman he'd dismissed, not the liability, not the temporary distraction. Amarachi. His Amarachi. His reason, his purpose, his everything. He understood now that the conversation he'd had with her, the words he'd thrown at her like weapons, had been lies. Self-protective lies from a man who'd been terrified of how much power she held over him. But there was no protection against what he felt. There was no escape from it. So he would stop trying to escape. By dawn, the Kong family had mobilized. Not openly, that would attract attention from law enforcement and rival families, but systematically and efficiently. They cut off the Saw family's supply lines, intercepted a shipment worth 50 million won, and bought out 3 key allies with promises of protection and profit. The message was clear: touch Amarachi and face total destruction. But it wasn't enough. Minho couldn't rest knowing she was in danger, knowing she was hidden away in some safe house, thinking he'd abandoned her. He couldn't let her exist in that world of uncertainty and fear. So he did something that violated every protocol of organized crime, every rule of engagement, every principle of safety. He contacted Detective Kim directly and arranged a meeting. The meeting took place in a park in the Itaewon district, neutral territory that both the Kong family and the National Police Agency had agreed not to violate. Minho met Detective Kim alone, a calculated risk that his brothers had argued violently against. "I want to make a deal," Minho said without preamble. Detective Kim, a man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and scars that suggested he'd lived a harder life than a detective's salary should have allowed, studied Minho carefully. "What kind of deal?" "I'll help you take down the Saw family," Minho said. "I'll provide evidence, testimony if necessary, access to my operatives who can testify to their illegal activities. In exchange, Amarachi gets immunity. Full immunity. No conditions, no ongoing cooperation required. She walks away clean." "Why would you do that?" Detective Kim asked, and Minho heard genuine confusion in his voice. "Because I love her," Minho said simply. "And because she was right. Justice does matter, even in our world. Especially in our world." Detective Kim was quiet for a long moment. Then, "She thinks you don't want her anymore. She thinks she ruined everything between you." Minho felt his heart constrict. "I know. That's why I'm doing this. To prove that I was wrong. That she was never the problem. That she's exactly what I need." It took 3 weeks of negotiation, during which the Kong family's legal team worked with federal prosecutors to construct an airtight case against the Saw family. Minho provided testimony that would have been suicide in any previous era of organized crime, but he protected himself by simultaneously achieving dominance over the criminal underworld through sheer force and strategy. By the time the Saw family was arrested, the balance of power had shifted so dramatically that the other crime families understood, cross the Kong brothers and face annihilation. But Minho didn't care about any of that. All he cared about was finding Amarachi and making her understand that he had never, ever stopped loving her. She was released from protective custody on a Thursday evening. Minho had tracked the details through Detective Kim, and he was waiting in the lobby of the safe house when they escorted her out. She looked smaller than he remembered, diminished by fear and loss. Her eyes were red, her smile gone. She looked like someone who'd had hope and had it systematically extracted from her life. When she saw him, every emotion that had been locked away broke free. "Minho," she whispered, and her voice broke. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms with the desperation of a drowning man grasping for air. She was crying, and he was holding her so tightly he worried he might crush her, but he couldn't let go. "Not ever again." "I'm sorry," he said into her hair. "I'm so sorry. Everything I said, it was all lies. I was terrified. I was trying to protect myself, and instead I hurt you, and I will spend the rest of my life making that up to you." Amarachi pulled back just far enough to look at him, her hands framing his face. "Detective Kim told me what you did. Why you did it." "I would burn the entire world to keep you safe," Minho said. "I thought I understood that before, but I didn't." "Not really. Not until you were gone and I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't exist in a way that made any sense." "I'm dangerous," Amarachi said, but it was a question now, not a statement. "I don't care," Minho replied. "I want dangerous. I want you. All of you, every version, every part. I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep with you in my arms. I want to protect you and be protected by you. I want to build something with you that's ours alone." Amarachi kissed him then, there in the lobby of the safe house, and Minho felt the world realign itself. Everything that had been broken was healing. Everything that had been lost was being found. Over the following weeks, Amarachi moved back into the penthouse, but it was different now. It was a home, not a fortress. Minho found himself wanting to know everything about her, her dreams, her fears, her childhood memories. She told him about losing her parents, about the loneliness that had shaped her, about how she'd been running her entire life because she'd never believed anyone would ask her to stay. "I'm asking you to stay," Minho said, 1 month after her release. They were on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the Seoul sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I'm asking you to marry me, Amarachi. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice." He pulled a ring from his pocket, a stunning diamond surrounded by sapphires, specifically designed to match the exact shade of her eyes. When she saw it, she gasped. "Yes," she said before he could even finish the question. "Yes, yes, yes. But Minho, I need you to understand, I'm going to keep trying to make things better. I'm not going to stop believing in justice, in redemption, in the possibility of change." "I know," Minho said, sliding the ring onto her trembling finger. "And I'm going to change, too. Not because I have to, but because you make me want to be better. You make me believe that better is possible." "What about your brothers? Your business? Your empire?" Amarachi asked, worry creasing her forehead. Minho smiled, that rare, predatory smile that now also held genuine warmth. "Junesio and Teo are taking over the legitimate operations. We're transitioning out of the criminal enterprises, carefully, strategically, but we're doing it. It's going to take time, but I'm done with a life built on fear and blood. I want to build something with you that's built on love instead." She believed him, though the transition took longer than either of them anticipated. It took 2 years, actually, 2 years of careful maneuvering, of paying off debts, of restructuring operations, of ensuring that the Khan family's legacy was secure even as they stepped back from the shadows. But through it all, Minho and Amarachi were constant. They married in a small ceremony at a private villa outside Seoul, with only Junesio and Teo in attendance. The brothers had surprised everyone, including themselves, by also falling in love with women who'd come into their lives through the chaos of transition. By the time Minho and Amarachi said their vows, the triplets were planning a double wedding. 6 months after the wedding, Amarachi discovered she was pregnant. She took the test in the penthouse bathroom, her hands shaking as the 2 pink lines appeared. A life. Their life. Growing inside her. When Minho came home that evening, she was waiting for him with the test in her hand. His entire face transformed when he understood what it meant, and he lifted her gently, spinning her around before setting her down with careful reverence and placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Our child," he whispered, and Amarachi heard the wonder and vulnerability in his voice. This man who commanded armies was undone by the news of new life. "Our child," she repeated, tears streaming down her face. Happy tears. Real tears. The pregnancy was not easy. Amarachi suffered from severe morning sickness, her hormones swinging wildly, her body changing in ways that sometimes frightened her. But Minho was there through every moment of it, holding her hair when she was sick, bringing her strange food cravings at 3 a.m., reading pregnancy books obsessively, talking to her stomach and making promises to a child who wasn't yet born. "I'm going to protect you," he would say, his hand cradling the curve of her belly. "I'm going to teach you that strength isn't about fear or domination. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything." By the 8th month, Amarachi could barely move. She was carrying twins, a surprise discovery at the 5-month ultrasound that had left them both stunned and joyful. Minho had turned the penthouse into a nursery, personally selecting every piece of furniture, painting the walls with soft pastels that felt nothing like his previous aesthetic. On the night she went into labor, Minho was more terrified than he'd been facing down rival crime families with guns drawn. They rushed to the hospital, and he refused to leave her side even for a moment, holding her hand through contractions that made her grip almost crush his bones. "I can't do this," she gasped during one particularly brutal contraction. "You can," Minho said, his voice steady and strong. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. You're going to do this, and we're going to have our babies, and everything that came before this, all the pain, all the fear, all the running, it's going to have meant something." When the twins were born, a boy and a girl, perfect and tiny and miraculous, Minho wept for the first time since he was a child. He held his daughter in his arms and felt something inside him transform completely. This was purpose. This was love in its purest form. This was redemption. They named the boy Hanjun, after Minho's grandfather, and the girl Zara, after Amarachi's mother. When they brought them home to the penthouse, Jun Seo and Teo arrived with their own wives and newborn babies, a boy and a girl from each brother's union. The triplets, who'd ruled the Seoul underworld with an iron fist, were now fathers and uncles, and watching them coo over the babies would have been comical if it wasn't so genuinely beautiful. 1 year after the twins were born, Minho and Amarachi renewed their vows in a ceremony that was very different from their first wedding. This time, it was public. The Kong family, transformed now into a legitimate real estate and tech empire, announced the ceremony in the society pages. Politicians attended. Business leaders attended. Even former Detective Kim came, now retired and working as a consultant for corporate security. Minho stood in a tuxedo and looked at his wife, more beautiful than ever, her curves lush with motherhood, her confidence radiating like its own form of power, and felt the weight of how far they'd come. "I love you," he said, the vows already behind them, but the words still needing to be spoken. "I love you too," Amarachi replied, her hand in his, their children watching from the front row with the solemn expressions of very young people who didn't understand but sensed something important was happening. The reception was held in the Seoul Grand Hotel, the same place Minho had held illicit crime family meetings years before. But now it was transformed into a celebration of love, of life, of the possibility of redemption even for those who'd lived in darkness. As the night wore on and Amarachi danced with her husband, surrounded by their family and friends, she reflected on the strange and impossible journey that had led her here. To a man who'd been a mafia boss, who'd ordered deaths without blinking, who'd been a predator and a possessor. but who'd also been capable of change. Capable of love. Capable of choosing something better. "What are you thinking about?" Minho asked, his hand on the small of her back, their bodies moving together with the ease of people who'd become one. "That life is strange," Amarachi said softly. "That we were never supposed to work. And yet, here we are," Minho said, pulling her closer. "Burning brighter than anyone could have imagined." As they danced, the Seoul skyline glittered through the windows of the ballroom, the city that had once belonged entirely to the Kong brothers, now shared with a family that had learned to love, to protect without possession, to lead without fear. Later, after the reception had ended and they were tucked into bed in the penthouse, their twins sleeping peacefully in their nursery down the hall, Minho held Amarachi against him and whispered into her hair. "Thank you for saving me. For showing me that there was more to life than power and control. For giving me this, a family, a home, a reason to want to be better." Amarachi turned in his arms to face him, and even in the darkness, he could see the love shining in her eyes. "Thank you for fighting for me. For choosing me. For proving that even the darkest soul can find light." They made love that night with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept, of futures built, of love that had conquered fear and danger and impossible odds. And when dawn broke over Seoul, painting the city in shades of gold and rose, a new day began, one where the Kong triplets, former rulers of the underworld, had become instead builders of something better. In the penthouse, in the rooms that had once been a fortress of darkness, there was now laughter. The sound of children playing, of a man learning to be a father, of a woman who'd once fought the world alone, now surrounded by family and love. The story that had begun with collision and possession, with danger and obsession, had ended with something far more beautiful: transformation. Redemption. A love so fierce it had burned away everything false and left only what was true. And in Seoul, the city of neon and secrets, the tale of the Kong triplets and the brilliant, fierce, beautiful Afro-Korean woman who'd saved them was told in whispers, becoming legend. A legend about a love that was stronger than power, more compelling than fear, more redemptive than any force on earth. The Kong family offices occupied the top 40 floors of Seoul's newest green-certified building. But the real heart of the operation was on the 42nd floor, where Minho's office had been transformed into a space that reflected his new life. Family photos lined the shelves: Amarachi and the twins, his brothers with their wives and children, their parents, who'd finally been brought into the fold after Minho had explained everything. He was finishing up a conference call with international partners about renewable energy expansion when his secretary announced that Amarachi and the children had arrived. Minho ended the call immediately. She walked in like she owned the place, which, in a sense, she did. Amarachi wore a cream-colored suit that hugged her curves perfectly, her braided hair pulled back in an elegant style. She was stunning, but what struck Minho most was the confidence in her bearing. She'd transformed from a woman running alone in the shadows to someone who stood in the light without flinching. The twins followed behind her, Hanjun holding her hand, little Zara perched on her hip. They'd inherited their father's intense eyes and their mother's warm skin tone. They were beautiful in a way that seemed to contain the best of both their worlds. "We wanted to surprise you," Amarachi said, kissing him as the children wrapped themselves around his legs. "The kids insisted on having lunch with Daddy." Minho picked up Hanjun and kissed his forehead, then took Zara from Amarachi and spun her around until she giggled. "How could I refuse that?" They ordered lunch from the restaurant in the building's ground floor, and as they ate together in his office with the Seoul skyline spread beneath them, Minho felt a peace he'd never imagined possible. This was his empire now, not built on fear or violence, but on love and connection. "I have news," Amarachi said, her eyes twinkling in a way that told Minho this was good news. "Detective Kim got me a job offer. Full-time position at a new non-profit focused on criminal justice reform and rehabilitation programs. They want me to head the program design division." Minho felt pride surge through him. "When do you start?" "I told them I needed to discuss it with my husband first," Amarachi said, and the way she said husband made it sound like a blessing, not a constraint. "Then start immediately," Minho said. "You'll be brilliant at it." You've already changed me, changed my family, changed everything I thought I knew about possibility. Imagine what you could do for hundreds of people. Hanjun tugged on Minho's sleeve. Papa, will Mama make bad people good? Minho looked at his wife, then back at his son. Mama will give bad people a chance to become good. Whether they take it or not will be up to them. After Amarachi and the children left to continue her afternoon of meetings about the new position, Minho stood alone at his office window, looking out at the Seoul skyline. He thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago, hard, closed off, convinced that power and control were the only truths worth believing in. That man would have thought the current version of himself was weak. But Minho knew better now. Strength wasn't about domination. Strength was about the ability to open your heart to another person and let them change you. Strength was about walking away from an empire built on fear and building something new founded on love. His phone buzzed with a text message from Amarachi, missing you already. Love you. Minho typed back, love you more. Always. That evening, when he came home to the penthouse, now a genuine home rather than a fortress, Amarachi was waiting for him on the balcony. The twins were asleep, tucked in their beds with nightlights shaped like stars casting soft shadows on their walls. She'd changed into comfortable clothes, but she was still breathtakingly beautiful to him. They stood together, watching the Seoul night, and Minho wrapped his arms around her from behind, breathing in the vanilla scent that had become synonymous with home. I've been thinking, Amarachi said softly. About? Minho prompted, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. About whether we should try for another baby. The twins are getting older, and I always wanted 3 kids. A boy and 2 girls, or maybe 2 boys and a girl. What do you think? Minho smiled against her hair. I think whatever you want, I'll give you. That's the deal I made on the day I saw you in that warehouse. Your happiness, your safety, your dreams, those are my purpose now. Amarachi turned in his arms and kissed him, slow and deep, full of promise and love. Then let's make another baby. Let's build this life even bigger. Later that night, in the bed where they'd first made love and sealed their fate together, Minho and Amarachi created new life, not just the potential child that might grow inside her, but a recommitment to their future, to the possibility of infinite tomorrows filled with love instead of fear. And in Seoul, the city of eternal neon, the triplets and the fierce, brilliant woman who'd saved them from the darkness lived their days in light. Not without challenges, life would never be that simple. But with love as their foundation, with family as their priority, with the knowledge that even the darkest souls could find redemption. Minho would later tell his children that their mother was his salvation, his light, his reason for believing in better. He would tell them about the day he saw her walk into a warehouse and felt his entire world shift. He would tell them that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is surrender to love, to let someone change you, to choose connection over dominion. And Amarachi, years later, would tell her children about the dangerous man who'd terrified her, who'd obsessed over her, who'd wanted to possess her, and who'd instead learned to protect her with the gentleness of true love. She would tell them that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was acknowledge their own capacity for change. The story of the triplets, especially Minho and Amarachi, would become legend in Seoul, whispered about in coffee shops, told to children at bedtime, remembered as the tale of how even the darkest empire could be transformed by love. But to Minho and Amarachi, it wasn't a legend. It was simply their life. Their beautiful, impossible, hard-won, absolutely perfect life together. 3 months later, Amarachi discovered she was pregnant again. This time, there was no shock, only joy and a quiet certainty that their family was expanding exactly as it should. Minho received the news at his office and left immediately, driving home through Seoul traffic with the recklessness of a man whose priorities had fundamentally shifted. He found her in the kitchen of their penthouse, preparing dinner with the twins helping by standing on stools beside her. Hanjun was stirring a pot of vegetables while Zara attempted to add ingredients to a mixing bowl, more ending up on her clothes than in the bowl itself. It was chaos and mess and exactly the kind of beautiful disorder that Minho had learned to treasure. Another baby? He asked, reading the answer in her glowing expression before she could speak. Due in 7 months, Amarachi confirmed, and when Minho embraced her, he could feel the tremor of happiness in her body. I was waiting for you to come home to tell you. I wanted you to hear it first. That evening, after the twins were asleep, Minho called his brothers to the penthouse. Juneseo and Teo arrived within the hour, their wives following shortly after. The triplets' transformation had been as dramatic as Minho's, though it had taken different forms. Juneseo had become deeply involved in legitimate real estate development, using the Kong family's capital to build affordable housing projects across Seoul. Teo had started a technology venture fund, investing in startups founded by people from underprivileged backgrounds. Both brothers had married women who'd come into their lives through the chaos of their transition. Juneseo's wife, Nari, was a social worker who'd initially been investigating the Kong family's philanthropic claims, only to fall in love with him during the process. Teo's wife, Seo-yoon, was a journalist who'd been writing an exposé on organized crime until she'd literally collided with him at a news conference and discovered that the man behind the empire was far more complex than his reputation suggested. Amarachi is pregnant, Minho announced once everyone was settled with drinks on the balcony overlooking Seoul. Juneseo and Teo erupted in congratulations, their wives hugging Amarachi with genuine warmth. The Kong family had become something Minho never imagined possible, not just a crime empire, but an actual family. A real family, with bonds of love rather than obligation. That makes 3 babies for the triplets, Nari said, laughing. She and Juneseo had a son, Minjun, who was 1 year old. The Kong children will outnumber the adults soon. With how many nieces and nephews does that make? Seo-yoon asked, doing mental math. 5? 6? 6, Teo confirmed. And if our plan works out, there will be at least 2 more before the year is over. Minho felt a strange peace settle over him as he watched his brothers with their wives. 3 men who'd been trained to see relationships as weaknesses, who'd built an empire on fear and violence, were now building something entirely different. Lives. Families. Futures that extended beyond the next power struggle or territorial dispute. Amarachi caught his eye across the balcony and smiled, that private smile that was just for him, that contained all the history of their impossible journey together. Minho excused himself and walked to her, pulling her into his arms despite their audience. He'd learned to stop caring what people thought about his displays of affection. If anything, his openness about loving his wife had become part of his legend. The Mafia boss who was utterly devoted to one woman. The impossible man who transformed into a devoted husband and father. I need to tell you something, Amarachi said softly, so only he could hear. The non-profit has asked me to expand the program nationally. They want me to travel, set up rehabilitation centers in 5 other cities, train counselors, establish best practices. It's a huge opportunity, Minho. It's everything I've worked toward. Minho heard the hesitation in her voice and understood immediately. She was worried he would feel threatened by her ambition, that her success would somehow diminish his. The old Minho, the man he'd been 3 years ago, probably would have. But he wasn't that man anymore. Then you do it, he said, kissing her forehead. You take the opportunity and you change lives and you show the world what you're capable of. I'll manage things here with the children. Juneseo and Teo will help. We have nannies, we have family. Amarachi, you built a non-profit from nothing with no capital and no connections. You've already proven you're brilliant. Now go prove it on a larger scale. But the baby, Amarachi started to protest. We'll manage, Minho said firmly. You'll take breaks, you'll come home regularly, and I'll be here holding down the fort. We're partners, Amarachi. Your dreams matter as much as mine. More, actually, because they're about helping people instead of making money. Over the following months, Amarachi threw herself into building the national program. She traveled to Busan, Daegu, Incheon, and Gwangju, establishing rehabilitation centers and training counselors to work with people transitioning out of organized crime. She brought with her the unique perspective of someone who'd lived on the edges of that world, who understood the psychology of those involved, who could speak to the possibility of redemption with the authority of someone who'd witnessed it firsthand. Minho, for his part, discovered that he had an unexpected talent for parenting. He'd been trained to give orders and expect obedience, but parenting required something far more nuanced: patience, creativity, the ability to see things through a child's perspective. He learned to braid Zara's hair, to read picture books with different voices for each character, to play on the ground without worrying about his clothes getting dirty. One evening, about 4 months into Amarachi's pregnancy, she came home from a trip to Busan looking exhausted but exhilarated. She'd successfully opened a new center and was training a team of local counselors. The work was fulfilling in a way that nothing else had been. Minho had dinner waiting, a meal he'd prepared himself, with help from Hanjun and Zara. The children had insisted on being involved in the cooking, so the presentation was chaotic and the flavor slightly off, but it was made with love. "You did this?" Amarachi asked, genuinely touched, when she saw the table set for her arrival. "The children did most of it," Minho said, pulling out her chair. "I merely supervised." Hanjun insisted on stirring everything, and Zara wanted to taste test multiple times. The results are questionable, but the effort was genuine. They ate together, the children chattering about their day, telling their mother about the park they'd visited, the new friend Hanjun had made in preschool, the fact that Zara had learned to count to 20. Minho watched his wife with their children, saw the way she listened intently to every word, the way she kissed the tops of their heads, the way she existed fully present in the moment despite her exhaustion. After the children were asleep, Amarachi and Minho sat on the balcony again, as they often did when she was home. The Seoul night glittered around them, the city that had been the center of Minho's dark empire now transformed into simply the backdrop of his life. "I've been offered a position," Amarachi said, her hand on her swollen belly. "Executive Director of the National Program. Full-time, based in Seoul, but with quarterly travel. It's a significant promotion and a meaningful salary increase. They want me to have oversight of all 5 centers, plus develop new initiatives." Minho felt a surge of pride. "Of course they do. When do you start?" "After the baby is born," Amarachi said. "I want to take time with the newborn, and I want to be present for the first months. But then, yes. I'd like to take the position." "Then that's what you'll do," Minho said. "And I'll be here, supporting you, managing the home, ensuring our children know their mother is a force of nature." Amarachi turned to look at him, and Minho saw moisture gathering in her eyes. "Do you know how much I love you? How grateful I am that you've become this man. I remember being terrified of you. I remember thinking you were a monster." "I was a monster," Minho said simply. "But you showed me that monsters can change. You believed in redemption for others, I just needed you to believe it was possible for me too." "I never believed you were irredeemable," Amarachi said. "Even when I was terrified, even when I hated you for pushing me away, I knew deep down that what I was seeing was just armor. Protection. Fear masquerading as cruelty." Minho pulled her closer, cradling her carefully, mindful of the baby growing inside her. "I love you, Amarachi. I love who you make me want to be. I love our children and the child we're creating. I love this life that feels impossible but is absolutely real." They made love that night with the tenderness of people who'd earned their happiness through pain and persistence. Not frantic or desperate, but slow and deliberate, full of promises and devotion. Afterward, as Amarachi drifted to sleep in his arms, Minho lay awake thinking about how far they'd come. The third child, a son they named Minjae, was born on a cold morning in February. Unlike the twins' dramatic entrance into the world, Minjae came easily, as if he understood that his parents had suffered enough and was determined to spare them additional trauma. He was perfect, small but healthy, with a tuft of hair that was decidedly more brown than his siblings, a perfect blend of his parents' heritage. Minho cut the cord himself, tears streaming down his face as the doctor placed the infant on Amarachi's chest. His wife looked at their newborn with a wonder that transcended language, and Minho knew that everything he'd done, every choice he'd made to build this life, had been worth it. Jun Seo and Teo arrived at the hospital within minutes of receiving the news. They found Minho in the recovery room, holding his newborn son while watching his wife sleep, completely overwhelmed by the reality of this new life. "He looks like you," Teo said, peering at the baby. Same intense expression. "This one's going to be trouble." "Good," Minho said, and meant it. He wanted his sons to inherit his strength but not his darkness. He wanted them to grow up knowing that power could be used for good, that control wasn't the same as dominance, that the strongest thing a man could do was love fiercely and openly. The following months were chaos in the best possible way. Amarachi returned to work when Min-jae was 3 months old, throwing herself into her expanded role while balancing motherhood, pregnancy fatigue that lingered despite having delivered, and a marriage that required constant attention to remain strong under the pressure of their demanding lives. But Minho had learned something crucial: strong relationships weren't about perfection. They were about showing up. They were about choosing each other again and again, especially when it would be easier to choose distance. One evening, about 8 months after Min-jae's birth, Amarachi came home furious. She'd had a difficult day at work. One of her counselors had relapsed, one of her clients had been rearrested, and a donor had withdrawn funding due to political pressure. She was frustrated, angry, and discouraged. Instead of trying to fix the situation, the old Minho's instinct, he simply held her while she cried. He let her vent about the unfairness of the system, the difficulty of helping people transform, the weight of responsibility she carried. "Maybe I'm not making a real difference," she said, her voice breaking. "Maybe I'm just delaying the inevitable for people who are going to end up back in that world anyway." "You saved me," Minho said quietly. "If you hadn't believed in my capacity to change, if you hadn't shown me that redemption was possible, I wouldn't be here. I'd either be dead or still ruling an empire built on violence. Do you understand what that means? You didn't just change my life, you changed the lives of my brothers, my children, the communities we now support through legitimate businesses. One person's redemption ripples outward, Amarachi. One person saved is infinite potential." Amarachi turned to face him, her eyes red but something stronger settling into her expression. "How are you so wise? You were ordering executions 3 years ago." Minho smiled. "I was always wise. I just used it for evil purposes. Love taught me how to redirect that wisdom toward good." Over the next year, more stories like that unfolded. There were moments of genuine struggle, times when Amarachi questioned her choices, when Minho struggled with old impulses, when the children were sick or difficult, or when work demanded more than seemed humanly possible to give. But there were also moments of profound joy. Hanjun's 5th birthday party, where Minho organized a treasure hunt through the penthouse and surrounding gardens. Zara's first dance recital, where she forgot her choreography but improvised with such confidence that the audience applauded wildly. Min-jae's first word, Papa, which Minho heard as the most beautiful sound in the universe. The Kong triplets' children grew up surrounded by cousins and love, in a household that was famous for its contradiction, the most powerful businessmen in Seoul who'd voluntarily stepped back from crime, who spent their evenings reading bedtime stories, who showed up to their children's school events without security details, who hugged their wives in public without shame. By the time the children were in elementary school, the story of the Kong brothers' transformation had become legendary. Business schools studied their transition from illegal enterprise to legitimate operations. Criminology professors discussed Minho's case as an example of redemption in action. Therapists pointed to his marriage with Amarachi as evidence that even the most damaged people could learn to love. But to Minho, all of that was secondary. What mattered was the everyday, waking up next to Amarachi, helping Hanjun with his math homework, watching Zara practice violin, holding Min-jae while he taught him about the world. 5 years after their first meeting in the warehouse, Minho stood in the audience of a large convention center in Seoul, watching his wife accept an award for her work in criminal justice reform. Amarachi wore a stunning emerald dress that hugged her still curvy frame, her braided hair adorned with gold, her smile radiant as she approached the microphone. "I have to tell you something," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying across the hall. 5 years ago, I was running. Running from my past, running from love, running from the possibility that change was possible. Then I met someone who was also running, from emotion, from vulnerability, from the idea that he could be anything other than what he'd been trained to be. She paused, and Minho knew she was looking directly at him even though the stage lights probably made it difficult for her to see the audience clearly. He showed me that redemption isn't about becoming someone new, Amarachi continued. It's about having the courage to access the person you always could have been but were too afraid to become. Every person in this room deserves that chance. Every person deserves to believe that their past doesn't have to define their future. That's what the centers we've built are about. Not punishment or judgment, but the radical act of believing in people's capacity for change. The standing ovation lasted for minutes. Minho stood with tears streaming down his face, proud beyond measure, completely overwhelmed by the woman he'd married. After the ceremony, when Amarachi had finished networking with donors and fellow advocates, she found him in the hotel lobby where he'd been waiting with their children. Hanjun and Zara had fallen asleep against Minho's shoulders, while Minjae sat on his lap, playing with his father's tie. "Did you see me?" Amarachi asked, kneeling down to kiss each child on the forehead before standing to embrace her husband. "I saw you," Minho said. "Everyone saw you. You were magnificent." "I was terrified," she admitted. "Public speaking still makes me nervous." "You hit it perfectly," Minho assured her. "You looked like someone who was born to stand in front of crowds and tell them about hope." They collected the children and went back to their hotel suite. After tucking the kids into bed, they traveled frequently now, and the children were comfortable sleeping in hotels. Minho and Amarachi sat on the balcony overlooking Seoul's glittering skyline. "I've been thinking," Amarachi said, taking his hand. "We've been married for 5 years. We have 3 beautiful children. We've built something incredible together. I think it's time we expanded our family again." Minho felt his breath catch. "You want another baby?" "I want another baby," Amarachi confirmed. "What do you think? Am I crazy? I have a demanding career, 3 kids already, and I'm 31 years old." "I think you're perfect," Minho said, pulling her into his lap. "I think our family isn't complete yet. I think we should have as many children as you want because you're the most incredible mother I've ever seen, and the world needs more people raised with your values and your heart." "My mother always wanted 6 children," Amarachi said softly. "She had me and my brother, but she wanted a big, loud, chaotic family. She didn't get that chance because she died too young. But maybe I can honor her by building the family she dreamed of." Minho held his wife against his chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart, understanding that he was holding a woman who'd been broken by loss and had chosen to transform that loss into purpose. She was extraordinary. "Then let's have as many children as you want," he said. "Let's build the family your mother dreamed of. Let's create chaos and love and noise and life in this penthouse and anywhere else we call home." They conceived their 4th child that night, creating new life from love and commitment and the absolute certainty that they were building something that would matter, something that would outlast them, something that would echo through generations. 7 years after that warehouse encounter, the Kong family held a celebration that surprised even those who'd been paying attention to their transformation. Minho and Amarachi announced that they were opening a foundation in honor of Amarachi's parents. The foundation would fund criminal justice reform initiatives, educational scholarships for children of incarcerated parents, and mental health services for people transitioning out of criminal life. The initial funding was substantial, 50 billion won, contributed equally by Minho and Amarachi. But more importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how the Kong family saw their wealth and their responsibility. At the foundation's launch event, held in a renovated warehouse in Seoul's Gangnam district, the same type of space where Minho and Amarachi had first met, the triplet brothers stood together and addressed the assembled crowd of media, politicians, activists, and business leaders. Minho spoke first. "My name is Kong Minho, and 7 years ago, I was a criminal," he said without preamble. The room went silent. Everyone knew this, of course, but hearing him say it so directly was different. I ordered executions. I trafficked in illegal goods. I built an empire on fear and violence. I was the kind of man that society wrote off as irredeemable. He paused, letting that truth settle. Then I met a woman named Amarachi who showed me that I was more than my past. Not by forgiving me, she never actually forgave me, not really. She held me accountable. But she believed that I could change, and in believing that, she gave me the possibility to actually do it. This foundation exists because she taught me that redemption is real, that people can transform, and that the most powerful thing a society can do is create systems that support that transformation rather than systems that prevent it. Junesio spoke next, talking about how he'd shifted the Kong family's real estate focus toward affordable housing. Teo discussed the technology fund's commitment to supporting entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds. Then Amarachi took the microphone. I stand here today as the wife of a man who was once a criminal, she said. As the mother of his children. As the director of national criminal justice reform programs that actually work. I stand here as proof that love can change systems, that relationships can be transformative, that the personal and the political are inseparable. She looked directly at Minho as she spoke. But I want to be clear about something, I didn't change my husband through love alone. I changed him by refusing to accept less than his best. I changed him by holding boundaries. I changed him by walking away when he didn't meet them. And most importantly, I changed him by believing that he had the capacity to become better, even when he didn't believe it himself. Amarachi paused, emotion thick in her voice. This foundation is named for my parents because they taught me that love without accountability isn't love, it's enabling. My mother and father raised me to believe in justice, in redemption, in the power of systems to either heal or harm. They died before they could see me build this life, but I know they're watching. And I know they're proud not just of what we're building here, but of how we're building it, with integrity, with purpose, with the absolute conviction that another world is possible. The applause that followed was thunderous. But what struck Minho most was the moment after the speeches ended, when Amarachi walked off the stage and came directly to him. She didn't acknowledge the cameras or the media, she just walked into his arms and kissed him, right there in front of everyone. Thank you, she whispered against his lips. For what? Minho asked. For becoming the man I always knew you could be. By the time their fourth child was born, another daughter, whom they named Akojua, after Amarachi's grandmother, the Kong family had become almost unrecognizable from its criminal origins. The legitimate businesses thrived, generating billions in revenue. The foundation was expanding internationally, opening programs in neighboring countries. The children were growing into thoughtful, empathetic humans who understood both privilege and responsibility. But it wasn't all perfect. There were still challenges, still moments of friction, still times when the ghosts of Minho's past resurfaced. One incident, in particular, threatened to destabilize everything they'd built. A journalist named Park Sung-min was investigating organized crime in Seoul, trying to build a case against remaining criminal enterprises. In the course of his research, he discovered evidence that Minho, during his years in the syndicate, had ordered the execution of a man named Lee Tae-sung. The execution was 15 years old, technically unsolved, but there was evidence, testimony from informants, documentation of financial transactions, communication records. The journalist published the story in a major news outlet, with the headline, "Reformed Mafia Boss Hid Murder Past." The article was careful not to accuse Minho of anything. Legally, the statute of limitations had passed for many crimes, and the evidence wasn't solid enough for prosecution. But it raised questions about accountability, about whether redemption could truly exist for those who'd committed heinous acts, about whether Minho's foundation work could be seen as anything other than reputation washing. Minho received the news while in a meeting with his brothers. Junesio had to physically restrain him from immediately calling a fixer and having the journalist removed as a threat. This was the old impulse, the criminal instinct that lived in Minho's bones even after years of transformation. Don't, Junesio said, his hand firm on Minho's shoulder. This isn't the answer. Not anymore. But Minho was shaking with rage and shame. the article was right. He had ordered that execution. And in building his new life, in becoming someone better, he'd managed to compartmentalize that reality, to treat it as a different version of himself that no longer existed. When Minho came home that evening, Amarachi took one look at him and knew something was wrong. She sent the children to bed early and sat with him in the penthouse's library, in the dark, waiting for him to speak. "I killed a man," he said finally. 15 years ago. The journalist has proof. The story is going to damage everything we've built, the foundation, the businesses, all of it. "I know," Amarachi said simply. Minho turned to look at her. "What do you mean, you know?" "I know because I've always known," Amarachi said. "Not about that specific man, but about the general fact that you ordered killings. You were a mafia boss, Minho. Of course you killed people. I'm not naive enough to think you didn't. Doesn't it disgust you?" Minho asked, his voice raw. "Knowing that you're sleeping next to a murderer?" "What disgusts me," Amarachi said quietly, "is a system that creates conditions where violence becomes normalized, where young men are groomed into criminal enterprises, where poverty and lack of opportunity push people toward the only sources of power available to them. What I'm not disgusted by is the fact that you've spent the last 7 years trying to change, trying to be better, trying to create systems that prevent others from following the path you followed." She took his hand, pressing it against her heart. "You're not asking me to forgive you for being a criminal," she continued. "You're asking me to forgive you for being human. For having been shaped by trauma and circumstance into a person who committed terrible acts. And I do forgive you, Minho. Not because what you did wasn't wrong, but because I know you, and I know that the person you are now would never make the same choices you made then." Minho pulled her into his arms and held her, allowing himself to feel the full weight of his past without trying to escape or minimize it. This was what Amarachi had taught him, that accountability and redemption weren't opposites. They were two sides of the same coin. The next morning, Minho did something that shocked everyone. He called a press conference and admitted to the murder from 15 years ago. He provided details, names, circumstances. He explained the context, not as an excuse, but as an explanation. He spoke about the systems that had failed Lee Tae-sung, that had pushed Minho toward criminal enterprise, that had created the conditions for his actions. Then he did something even more shocking. He donated 50 billion won to a trust fund established for Lee Tae-sung's surviving family members. The media didn't know what to do with a criminal who was voluntarily confessing, who was accepting responsibility, who was attempting to make restitution. The story dominated news cycles for weeks, but the narrative that eventually emerged was different from what the journalist had intended. Instead of exposing hypocrisy, Minho's honesty became proof of genuine transformation. The image of a once dangerous mafia boss standing before cameras and admitting his crimes, while his Afro-Korean wife stood beside him with her hand on his arm, it became iconic. It became a symbol of what redemption could look like. Law enforcement initially moved to press charges, but Amarachi's team of lawyers, and more significantly, public pressure and media attention, convinced the prosecutors that pursuing a case with such weak evidence against a man who was voluntarily confessing served no one. The case was closed without prosecution. 10 years after their first meeting, Minho and Amarachi stood at the opening of the 10th Criminal Justice Reform Center in Seoul. Amarachi had expanded her program so significantly that she was now internationally recognized as an expert in rehabilitation and criminal justice reform. Minho stood beside her, not as a supporting figure but as a full partner in the work, having redirected all his business acumen toward making the foundation successful. Their children, Hanjun, now 15 and showing signs of inherited intelligence and his mother's moral compass, Zara, 13 and already passionate about human rights, Minjae, 10 and obsessed with science, and little Akojua, 5 and fearless in a way that suggested she'd inherited her father's intensity and her mother's defiance, were growing into remarkable humans. The youngest, Akojua, was attending the opening ceremony because she'd insisted on it. She wanted to see this center where Mama helps people, and neither of her parents had the heart to leave her behind. As they walked through the new facility, Akojua held both parents' hands, asking questions about everything. What was rehabilitation? How did people change? Could anyone become better, or only some people? Minho and Amarachi exchanged a look, and then Amarachi knelt down to speak to her daughter at eye level. Everyone has the capacity to change, Amarachi said. But not everyone wants to, and not everyone has people around them who believe change is possible. That's what these centers do, they create communities of people who believe in transformation and help people access that belief for themselves. Did Papa change? Akojua asked innocently. Your father changed more than anyone I've ever known, Amarachi said, standing up and wrapping her arm around Minho. He went from being someone who hurt people to someone who dedicates his life to helping people heal. He's my favorite example of human transformation. Minho felt tears threatening and blinked them back. He didn't know who he would be if he'd never met this woman, but he knew with absolute certainty that it would be a diminished version of himself. That evening, after all the children were asleep, Minho and Amarachi sat on their balcony as they had countless times before, watching the Seoul skyline glitter beneath the stars. I've been thinking about what Akojua asked, Minho said. About change. About whether everyone can transform. I think the answer is more complicated than yes or no. I think everyone could transform, but most people never get the chance or the motivation to try. And you had both? Amarachi asked. I had you, Minho said simply. That was the chance and the motivation. Everything else followed from that. Amarachi leaned her head against his shoulder. I've been thinking about something else. About our story. About how it started with collision and obsession and possession, and somehow transformed into partnership and love. It was always love, Minho said. I just didn't know that's what it was. I thought it was hunger. I thought it was greed. But it was love, the overwhelming need to protect you, to be near you, to make your life better. That's love in its truest form. Do you regret it? Amarachi asked. Our story, I mean. Do you wish you'd met me some other way? That it had been simpler? Not for a second, Minho said. Our story had to be this way. It had to be intense and dangerous and complicated because that's who we both are. Passion without danger wouldn't have been enough to reach through my armor. Love without stakes wouldn't have been sufficient to make me believe in transformation. We found each other at exactly the moment we were ready to find each other. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Minho spoke again. I want to tell you something I've never said before, he said. In all our years together, through everything we've built, all the children we've created, I have never once regretted walking into that warehouse and seeing you. Not even for a moment. Not even when I was terrified of losing everything. Because losing you would have been the actual loss. Everything else is just noise. Amarachi turned in his arms to face him, and in the moonlight reflecting off the Seoul skyline, Minho could see tears streaming down her face. I love you, she said. Past tense, present tense, future tense. I have loved you, I love you, I will love you. Always. They made love on the balcony, beneath the Seoul night sky, with the city sparkling around them like a witness to their devotion. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the slow certainty of people who'd earned the right to this intimacy through years of commitment and growth. 12 years after their meeting, on the anniversary of the day Amarachi had walked into that warehouse auction, Minho organized something elaborate. He told Amarachi they were attending a business dinner, but instead, he brought her back to the warehouse, now completely renovated and transformed into an event space. She walked in wearing the same colored dress she'd worn the day they met, a fitted black dress that hugged her curves, though now she wore it with the confidence of a woman who was completely comfortable in her own skin, her own power, her own worth. The warehouse had been decorated with thousands of purple flowers, her favorite color. And inside, waiting for them, were their 4 children, Minho's brothers and their families, Amarachi's colleagues and closest friends, and Detective Kim, now retired and living a quiet life. What is this? Amarachi asked, completely surprised, which delighted Minho because his wife was usually impossible to surprise. This, Minho said, taking her hand, is a celebration of 12 years of redemption, transformation, love, and partnership. 12 years of you saving me. 12 years of us building something neither of us thought possible. He dropped to one knee, even though they were already married, and pulled out a ring, not an engagement ring this time, but an anniversary ring, a band of white gold embedded with purple diamonds. Amarachi, he said, his voice steady and strong, I want to renew my vows to you. Not because anything has changed, but because everything has changed. We have more children than we dreamed of. We've built a foundation that's transforming lives. We've created a family that's strong and real and full of love. I want to stand here in front of everyone who matters and tell the world that you are the best decision I've ever made, that choosing you was the moment my real life began. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and the warehouse erupted in applause. Amarachi was crying, laughing, unable to form words. But when Minho stood and pulled her into his arms, she kissed him with all the passion and devotion that they'd built together over more than a decade. The celebration lasted until midnight. Their children gave speeches, some touching, some hilarious, all of them proof that Minho and Amarachi were doing something right in how they raised their family. Juniseo and Teo spoke about how their oldest brother's transformation had inspired their own, how seeing Minho learn to love had made them believe it was possible for themselves. Detective Kim, now in his 70s, gave a toast that had everyone in tears. When I first approached Amarachi about becoming an informant, he said, I was looking for information. What I found instead was a young woman searching for purpose. I never imagined that purpose would lead her to falling in love with a criminal, much less that it would lead to his complete transformation. But watching these two build this life, watching them create something from the wreckage of their pasts, it's restored my faith in the possibility of redemption. At the end of the night, as guests were leaving, Minho pulled Amarachi aside. Come with me, he said, taking her hand and leading her up to a private room on the second floor of the warehouse that had been prepared in advance. Inside, there was a bed draped in soft silk, candles burning, rose petals scattered across the floor. It looked like something from a fairy tale, which made Amarachi laugh despite the tears still streaming down her face. You're ridiculously romantic, she said, but she was already moving toward him, already pulling him close. Only for you, Minho said, and proceeded to show her exactly how much 12 years of devotion felt when expressed physically, with tenderness and intensity, with the certainty of someone who'd learned that sex and love were inseparable, that intimacy was the ultimate vulnerability and also the ultimate strength. Afterward, tangled together in the silk sheets, Amarachi traced patterns on Minho's chest while he played with her braids. I'm pregnant, she said quietly. Minho went absolutely still. What? I'm pregnant, Amarachi repeated, amusement in her voice at his shocked expression. About 6 weeks along. I was waiting for the right moment to tell you, and I thought tonight, after you did all this, might be perfect. Minho felt something crystallize in his chest, joy, wonder, amazement that this woman could still surprise him, could still gift him with new life, could still choose to expand their family even after everything they'd already built. Another baby? He breathed. Our fifth, Amarachi confirmed. Is that okay? I know I'm 39, and we already have 4, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our family wasn't quite complete yet. Instead of answering, Minho rolled on top of her carefully and kissed her, deep and thorough, pouring everything he felt into it. When he pulled back, he was smiling so widely his face hurt. It's perfect, he said. You're perfect. Our life is perfect. Our life is messy and complicated and sometimes exhausting, Amarachi corrected. But it's ours, and it's real, and it's built on love that actually means something. That's what perfect is, Minho said. It's not fairy tales or Instagram moments. It's choosing each other every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. 15 years after that fateful day in the warehouse, the Kong family had become something that criminology professors studied and women's advocates pointed to as proof that transformation was real. Minho and Amarachi had 5 children, Hanjun at 20, about to graduate from university with a degree in criminal justice, Zara at 18, already working with her mother at the foundation, Minjae at 13, showing promise in both academics and athletics, Akoju at 8, with her father's intensity and her mother's compassion, and newborn Kwame, named after Amarachi's father, who'd just turned 1. The foundation had expanded to 15 countries. Amarachi had written a book about criminal justice reform that was being translated into dozens of languages. Minho had stepped fully into legitimate business, his empire now focused on sustainable development and community investment. But the most remarkable thing about the Kong family wasn't their professional success or their philanthropic work. It was the quiet everyday life they'd built, a family that laughed together, that supported each other, that wasn't afraid to argue about values and then resolve those arguments through genuine communication and compromise. On an autumn evening 15 years after Amarachi had first walked into that warehouse, Minho sat in the living room of their penthouse with his wife, their 2 youngest children asleep on either side of them. Amarachi was reading policy briefs for an international criminal justice conference she was attending next month. Minho was reading their oldest son's essay on corporate social responsibility. "Do you remember," Amarachi said without looking up from her work, "that first day? In the cafe? When you told me I belonged to you?" Minho smiled. "I remember thinking you were the most infuriating, beautiful, brilliant woman I'd ever seen. I remember thinking my brothers were wrong about everything, and I was going to prove it by making you see me not as a threat but as someone capable of loving you. And here we are," Amarachi said, finally looking up. 15 years later. 5 children. A foundation that's helped thousands of people. 2 careers that matter. A life that actually means something. "Here we are," Minho agreed, reaching over to take her hand. "Do you regret any of it?" "Not for a second," Amarachi said. "Every moment of anger, every moment of confusion, every moment of doubt, it all led to this. To a life with you. To a family. To work that matters." Minho squeezed her hand. "I would do it all again. Every obsessive moment, every jealous fit, every moment of fear. I would do it all again if it meant ending up here, with you, in this life." "Even the terrible parts?" Amarachi teased. "When I drove you absolutely insane?" "Especially then," Minho said. "Because you were teaching me how to be human. You were teaching me that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites. That power and love weren't mutually exclusive. That a man could rule empires or build homes, and the building of a home was actually the greater achievement." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the Seoul night, aware that their children were sleeping peacefully in their rooms, that their extended family was thriving, that the work they were doing in the world was creating real change. Minho thought about the man he'd been 15 years ago. Cold, calculating, convinced that power and fear were the only truths worth believing in. That man seemed like a stranger, though he existed in Minho's bones, in his instincts, in the part of him that would still move heaven and earth to protect his family. But Amarachi had shown him that protection could be gentle. That strength could be used for love instead of domination. That the most powerful thing a man could do was admit his mistakes and commit to change. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" Amarachi asked. "For everything," Minho said. "For seeing me when I was hidden behind armor. For believing I could change. For loving me anyway. For building this life with me. For giving me children who are better than I ever was. For saving me." Amarachi leaned over and kissed her husband, a simple kiss, but full of 15 years of history, of struggle, of redemption, of a love that had started with obsession and transformed into something real and true and unshakable. "You saved yourself," she said. "I just believed you could do it." "No," Minho replied. "You saved me. And I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that, for you, for this family we created together." As the Seoul night deepened and the city lights reflected off the penthouse windows, Minho held his wife against him, feeling the weight of their sleeping children, understanding with absolute clarity that this was everything. This was the empire that mattered. This was the legacy worth leaving. The man who'd once ruled the underworld with fear and violence had found something far more powerful, a reason to be better. A person to be better for. A family that believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. And as Minho closed his eyes, listening to Amarachi's breathing, feeling the warmth of his children beside them, he understood that he was the luckiest man alive. Not because he had wealth or power or influence, though he had all of those things. But because he had love. Real, transformative, redemptive love. He had Amarachi. And that was everything. The end.